All right, so let's take a look at this example of using the completing the square method to solve an equation, specifically a quadratic equation. This problem, I'm going to tell you, would not work nicely with algebra tiles. However, if you wanted to give it a try, you certainly could go through the process like I did in the last section of trying it out to see, is this going to work with algebra tiles or not? Or you could just say, the completing the square method will work for any quadratic. So maybe I don't see any obvious way of factoring it right out off the top of my head, so I'm going to default to the completing the square method and not waste any time. So what I'm saying here is, if you're not sure if it works for factoring or not, aka all the material from lesson 3, if you're not sure if it works or not, default to using this second method because it will always work. The factoring method works sometimes, the completing the square method works all the time. Now, does that make the factoring method unhelpful? I would say no, because if it works easily, it saves you time. If it doesn't work easily, we use a secondary method so that we don't waste time. All right, so let's see what we would need to do in order to solve this equation. We don't see any obvious ways to factor it into two pairs like this. I don't see any obvious ways to use the number negative 12x and positive 28. And so I decide I'm not actually going to use that method. I'm going to use completing the square. The first step is to move everything away except for the x squared term and the x term. So move the ones. So leave x squared and x and move the ones. In this case, the ones are the 28. So let's move it to the other side in a sense to get it out of the way. So we have x squared minus 12x, we don't know what we need here, equals negative 28. We keep the balance of our equation by not changing it. Right? We didn't take 28 completely away, we just moved it from the left side of the scale to the right side of the scale. Now, in order to make this a nice solvable equation that has only one x, because look, we have an x squared and an x, can't isolate the variable, so we have a problem. The second step we need to do is we need to turn the left side into a perfect square. So we need to, I'll just draw perfect square. We need to think about the shape. We have our x squared here, and we have 12 negative x's, and we want to make it a square-shaped box. Well, that means I need to put 6 negative x's over here and 6 negative x's over there, so that we'll have x minus 6 times x minus 6. That would be using these blocks to create a perfect square. X minus 6 by x minus 6. And again, I get that number from looking at the negative 12 and trying to distribute them equally to make a square shape. So here's our question. How many ones do we need to complete the square? See, that's where we come up with this terminology, complete the square. In order to complete the square, I need to give it the appropriate number of ones. Well, how big is this section? How many ones can fit in here? And we find this by looking at the dimensions. This is negative 6. Can I write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? We'll just add another one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, 6 by 6 is going to give me a total of 36 ones. Now remember, that will be positive because whenever I multiply a negative by a negative, it gives me a positive. So this square is complete if there are 36 ones. So my third step is to add the appropriate number of ones to the left and right, because we don't ever do anything to the left without doing it to the right. So let's look at a different color so we can distinguish this next step. We say in order to complete the square, I need 36 ones. So here we have the idea that negative 6 plus negative 6 gives me my 12 x's, and negative 6 times negative 6 gives me my 36 ones. So we're fitting that, that pattern that we talked about in the last video. If I add 36 ones to the left, I have to do it to the right as well. Otherwise, we throw this whole equation out of balance and we won't get the right answer. So add 36 to the left and add it to the right. Let's simplify. And there are two ways that we need to simplify. We need to rewrite this in its nice factored form, which would be either, so actually I need a place to write a fourth step. Forgive me for writing them sideways. I'm going to write them sideways up here. So the next step is factor our square, which will be x minus 6 times x minus 6, which I can write nicely as x minus 6 squared, right? X minus 6 times itself. X minus 6 times x minus 6. And we also can combine negative 28 and 36 to get 8. So now I have my equation. X minus 6 squared equals 8. Is this solvable? Yes, it is, because I only have one variable now. So I went from having an x squared and an x, and I couldn't put them together, so I couldn't isolate the variable. But when I factored it into a perfect square, I turned it into a solvable equation because there's only one x. So now I just solve it the normal way. So our last fifth step is just solve as usual. That means doing things like undo the square with a square root. But remember, whenever we undo a square, we always end up saying plus or minus our answer. These cancel. Plus or minus the square root of 8. You don't need to turn that into a decimal. You can just leave it the square root of 8. And over here, the square and the root cancel, so I just have x minus 6. Because the square and the square root undo each other. And then I add 6 to both sides. So my answer is x equals 6 plus the square root of 8 or 6 minus the square root of 8. And those are my two answers. I can also write that shorthand 6 plus or minus the square root of 8 so that I don't have to write it twice. Or I can write it separately like this. Either way, I get my solution. And that is another example of completing the square, or using the completing the square method to solve quadratic equations. Okay, there are a few more pieces of information that we will need to discuss in class, but I'm going to leave it at that for our notes because I think that's a good launching point for the beginning of our class. Make sure you have those notes completed and you will be ready to go for tomorrow.